Welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast, proudly presented by Venture Hunting and Outdoors. If you're like us and passionate about hunting, spearfishing, and many other outdoor-related pursuits, with an eagerness to fast-track your learning, then this podcast is perfect for you. G'day legends and welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast. Today we are focusing solely on bedded shots on boars. So whether that's with the bow or rifle, these close quarter encounters often always with reduced shot angles on hidden or somewhat obstructed pigs. And to be honest, they require plenty of thought and almost always demand top quality gear, whether that's the projectile or the pointy end of the arrow in the bow hunter's instance. And this has all come about for us and more relevant after a recent adventure that James and I had with Dingo Creek Hunting safaris up in Australia's Northern Territory, where we were primarily chasing banteng with the bow, but did stumble across a few boars in the floodplains there of Cobourg Peninsula. And to be honest, we very quickly realised that the theme of the trip when it came to the boars was that they were all going to be bedded shots primarily. And I think this was just coming down to pairing the hot conditions, the limited water sources at that time of the year, and the tendency of these boars to want to be seeking shade and sort of shelter very close to their food and water sources. This is how we found basically all of these boars, and that was that they were all bedded up. So today you're going to hear all about the action and some of our takeaways from that trip. As always, we're also going to touch on a few FAQs, which we get sent in from you guys, our valued listeners. If you have any questions, please email us at info@twinelements.com.au or simply send us a DM on Instagram through either Twin Elements, Ayden Doumtsis Outdoors or James Doumtsis Outdoors. And as always, we will strive to answer them and get them featured on the podcast. Without further ado, we'll jump in. Whether it's hunting, fishing, hiking, or any other activity in the great outdoors, Dog and Gun Coffee is ready to fuel your adventures. Their preloaded drip filters are a game changer and help you enjoy cafe quality coffee in the wild. Their dark roast, the Samba blend, is my personal favourite. The legends over at Dog and Gun Coffee have extended their support to you to help us discover your brew of choice today. Use code TWIN10, that's numerical number 10, at checkout for $10 off your first order.
So as you guys would have seen, I'm sure, our part 3 and part 4 of our banteng and boar hunting series up in the Northern Territory focuses heavily on bedded boars. So whether that be in wallows or just bedded up in the mud, or beds around sort of this lagoon, this last little bit of water. And really the benefits of hunting these boars in their beds is, it's obvious that they're going to be in a stationary location. So pigs naturally sort of when they're feeding and especially if they're moving from, a bedding area to a feeding area of water, they generally, especially boars, they move quite quickly and it can be quite difficult to keep up with them. Whereas when they're stationary, bedded, you've got all the time in the world, really, unless they're going to get up and leave the watercourse or like even in a bedding area, whether it be in a creek, like they tend to not get up too much and go and move to a different bed. Like typically speaking, they're going to stay there. They might shuffle around and relocate their location within that bed, but they're fairly stationary. The next thing is, given that it's going to be likely that they're fairly well covered up and protected, whether it be with, fallen logs or under the bank of a creek or something like that, or even mud or water, you're talking about close range shooting, which is fantastic, whether it be a bow or a rifle, firstly from the challenge of the hunt, but also just the fun of getting in there, just to make sure that you're going to be successful and hit the animal where it's required. And thirdly, once you've found that pig, you've essentially got the element of surprise. Like you can take as long as you want to get in there, prefacing that the wind is going to stay good and true, because really then the only thing that's going to scare that animal is you being too noisy on your approach or you getting seen on your approach, which with correct planning, it should be a variable that you can control.
And I think just to build on these points further, especially considering what James mentioned there about animals that are up and about feeding, normally with a big mature feral boar, it's that first couple of minutes of daylight, last couple of minutes of the day when they're coming back out to feed. And then primarily they're going to be nocturnal, hiding in the secrecy of darkness or the shadows sort of thing, especially in the mountains. So one of those things that when I think of bedded boars, it's the heat of the day, middle of the day. In theory, the wind should be the best that it's possibly going to be. Sure, when you're hunting some creeks and lagoons and stuff, it might be a bit more fickle. But when I think of bedded boar hunting, it's the heat of the day. They're not really moving. You generally do buy a lot more time. It's a lot less, we've got to get in front of this boar and try and cut him off. And that's when you sort of obviously running on a lot more instincts and things like that, which can be really good. But the bedded boar hunting becomes a lot more slow. And generally once you find the animal or you're hunting in that creek line and you stumble onto one boar, it's amazing how often at times you'll have a second, third, fourth pig in pretty close proximity afterwards, because they're all chasing that same resource. And whether it's just simply shade and a bit of protection close to a feeding or bedding or sort of water point, there's a very high affinity for finding animals in close proximity to one another.
Yeah, normally when you find that perfect creek system, whether it be because there's high banks or whether you find that watercourse, and especially talking, northern Australia, like, the Cape York area obviously gets a lot of attention, Northern Territory, for chasing these bedded boars, especially out west. Like, we're talking about areas where there's limited resources, and the main one being water, like later on in the year when the pigs really concentrate. And obviously we found in these videos this tiny little bit of water that didn't have a croc, and that was the resource that the pigs were really chasing. And then after that, because in places like Cape York and Northern Territory, they're so secluded, you don't necessarily get them. They go and find beds with shelter and stuff like that, which do limit shot angles. But generally speaking, they're not in like the thickest of brush, like in sort of the mountains, just say when we're chasing bedded pigs. Most of these scenarios are going to be when you find them bedded, like around water or in a creek system, rather than sort of in super thick gullies and blackberry bushes and all that type of things. But the same principles apply with shooting bedded boars, as we'll discuss in a little bit.
I also see these bedded boar hunts as an opportunity for you to really test how stealthy you are and how much noise concealment you can have, how well calculated your stalks, your approaches, your gear, all of these different things are, and how well they stand up to an animal that, in theory, if you do everything right, with the main consideration for me being the wind or the moment leading up until the wind's going to swirl, knowing that, it's not often going to be perfect, you need to just be as quiet as possible, as stealthy as possible, because again, you're hunting an animal that is sitting there. It's not like you get into 20 meters and then it gets up and walks away 5 meters, or it feeds away from you and stuff. And I know in the instances of, a deer that's feeding, there is a potential for them to just walk into you and stumble into you, which obviously makes that stalk a little bit easier. But as far as actually stalking in on a bedded animal, it is you against that animal. There's no real other variables except for how quiet you can be, how stealthy you can be, and then choosing like a really appropriate line. And again, trying to do all of that before in the back of your mind, that the wind's going to swirl eventually. And I think that's the one thing that sometimes gets people caught out is they think, oh shit, I've just seen this boar and he's bedded. I've got to actually get in on him immediately, instead of going, oh, if I don't walk in on a straight line and take 20 steps to the left, coming on that game trail, I'm actually going to have a better, more broadside shot or a slightly quartering away shot compared to like an arse-on shot from exactly where I've seen him in this sort of line. And just taking a second to sort of assess, like I know they are stationary in a very predictable location, but then being able to use that to your advantage is something that really, is going to play into your cards as to how the stalk and the hunt unfolds.
And I think just touching on the topic that Ayden said, like that's really is a critical point with bedded boars, in the sense that people often, they see a pig and like they might have needed to walk 1 or 2 kilometers of a creek line, or, they might have needed to check a couple of watercourses before finding that pig. And the immediate assumption, and I mean, as someone that I would count ourselves as somewhat experienced hunters, like the immediate thing that our body and brain tells us is, oh, we've quickly got to get in there because like they're going to leave or whatever. But the fact is, it's like, they've probably been on that water, or especially if it's not on water, but just like bedded in a creek, like they've probably been in that bed for a couple of hours by the time that you find them. So it's like the likelihood that it's like in the minute or two that you're going to like run in there. Because often with these scenarios, like it's not like we're hunting chital deer where you're seeing them on big open areas and you're spotting them from 500. Like normally you're spotting bedded boars at 100 meters or less. So really, like closing into 20 or 15 or whatever is not like we're talking about a 2 or 3 minute stalk. So taking an extra minute to sort of, arc out and be out of cover, or, come down off the bank or go up higher, or take some time, it pays dividends in this scenario. And not rushing in, which is like everyone's first instinct, including myself. Like, you really do need to like sort of get yourself under control. And obviously on this podcast, we've spoken a lot about, buck fever and just controlling that urge and that lust and that emotion to sort of almost rush in there. And, even experienced hunters, you see it all the time where it's like, oh, quickly just like go in there. It's just like, no, like take your time, assess the animal. Okay, he's bedded like this. This is the most likely scenario. And I mean, if he does get up and move, well, it's most likely, especially in the heat of the day, he's just going to move and only walk, 100, maybe a couple of 100 meters and bed up. Like, it's not like he's just going to disappear and just start, running over the ridge. Like, you've still got him within sight. So, just taking that time, doing the best stalk that you possibly can do, which is often not just moving straight in on the bedded pig.
And that's definitely where impulse control is going to be massive in these situations. Again, because you've got a pig that's completely relaxed. It's bedded, it's sleeping, it's got most of the time its eyes closed, maybe one ear pricked up, listening for danger, all this type of stuff that we'll get into in a second when we talk about, I guess, the challenges of bedded boars. But what James spoke about there about not rushing in super quickly. If you can imagine a boar that's been sitting in the sun for an hour in his wallow, completely undisturbed, maybe he's heard, domestic cattle come down, have a drink, walk away, maybe bed on the bank. The odd, masked lapwing, which is an Australian native bird, do like a little alarm call every so often when it sees a whistling kite. If you then come in over the bank and go, holy crap, there's a big boar there at 50 meters, I've got to now cut the distance from 50 to sub 20, and you take, obviously those 30 or 40 steps really quickly. And instead of hearing that lapwing, that masked lapwing, and its alarm call every 5 minutes over the last hour, if they now accelerate to an interval of every 6 seconds because of how fast you're walking or popping into their range, that boar's going to go, hold on, there's something going on here. Like, it's the same as if we're in our, bedroom and once a night you hear an alarm from a siren or an ambulance or something. It's a lot different to if suddenly there's 7 cop cars in your street with their sirens on. You're going to be getting up out of bed going, what's going on out the window there? And that's sort of the best analogy as to how I can explain it. The same goes for you take 5 too many extra steps and suddenly those cattle that were sleeping on the other side of the bank are now running the other direction and twanging through fences or breaking sticks and stuff. There's no way that boar's going to remain, unalert, unknown, beknownst to your presence. And that just changes things because then suddenly he sort of gets up, shifts, he's sort of more alert, he's listening, he starts sniffing for the wind, and there's more chance that that's going to obviously swirl, and then he's out of there and the hunt's over. So impulse control and just letting things come naturally and sort of being pretty calculated and just getting yourself to slow down a second will definitely play into a lot as to how the hunt unfolds.
So one of the other big challenges that we face often with bedded boars is that the shot angles presented to us are obviously very limited. Like, it's not like when you've got a feeding pig, they might feed broadside and then they move arse on, and then you can wait and they sort of, they're front on, and then they swing back to broadside or quartering away or quartering on, like, because they're not moving and that shot angle isn't changing all the time. It's pretty much a set position. It's like, okay, this is where the pig's going to be bedded. Like, I mean, you do get the odd time where they sort of shift and rotate a little bit, which may help or, hinder your shot angle. But for the most part, the best thing about it, like we talked about, is that you can predict for it and plan for it. So like, first thing, which way is the wind coming? Secondly, cool, that's where they're lying. And then it's like, okay, this is the angle. And it may be that you have to get up on the bank, or it may be that you have to get up on the dam bank, or it may be that you have to come around 180 degrees from, the direction that you're traveling to try and get in there, wind pending. But the thing is, it's just like you're trying to work out, where and how they're lying. So most of the time, they could be bedding straight upright. So bedding like in what I'd call sternal, where they're sort of on their belly and the base of their chest, like their brisket. But I mean, they can also be bedded on their side where they're leaning directly on their left, and you're sort of shooting them through more between the scapulas down through the top of the back, or potentially even more from the belly up and stuff like that. But really the thing is just making sure that you've got like a strategy in place to work out exactly the way that they're lying, and take some time to get in there and plan your stalk to get the best shot angle available.
I think one of the things you've got to acknowledge here as well when it comes to shot angles is we're often forced into either very tight sort of quartering away arse on shots, or very tight quartering front on, quartering on shots, purely based on how those animals are positioned strategically through years and years of evolution, in the sense of a deer, a pig, buffalo, whatever it may be, is quite commonly you'll see them walk, get to a bedding area if it's under a clump of trees, sort of facing the direction where the wind is coming from, a certain position, rolling over their back and hitting them so that they can smell that sort of, 180-degree area, depending on how the wind's traveling. And then also look the opposite way to where they can't smell, but then that's the way they'll often bed down and face. So by knowing this, they're trying to achieve 360-degree views and smell of danger and be completely safe and aware of what's coming. So if we're walking into the wind, we should be preparing most of the time to be coming onto animals that are either facing or looking our direction. There's the off chance where an animal stuffs up in nature, where they've got the wind coming to their face and they're looking that way. And for us, that's perfect, because it means that they're facing, into the wind. We're coming onto their arse, which means we basically have, again, as long as we're quiet, they're never going to see us. Because the wind's blowing straight in our face, they're not going to smell us unless it switches. The biggest thing there is just edging out slowly to achieve either a nice, quartering away or broadside shot. But again, they shouldn't be able to see us or smell us, any of these factors that we're worried about.
Option Archery makes specialist hunting gear. I'll never not be able to use equivalizer again. They're truly one of my favourite bits of kit. It combines a stabilizer and equivalizer to increase the functionality of my hunting strategy. It enables me to put my bow on my shoulders, which enables me to glass more when I'm out in the field. Shop both equivalizers and their option sight range today by heading to the website. One of the other issues when shooting bedded boars is often there's, water or brush, whether it be leaf litter, obstructing your shot as well. So whether it be in a wallow or whether it be in a bed that a pig's dug, like they often actually bed down and dig, it might be 4, 5, 6 inches down. So often, and depending on how they're lying, like what you can see is you've generally lost like a third of the animal. So what people then do is they sort of, a lot of people with pigs shoot halfway up the body, just say. And so if a third of that pig is already under the waterline or under in the mud, or especially with these boars that you would have seen in these videos, like sometimes they're like almost little submarines, like they're fully submerged in the mud. And the thing is, like, if you then go, oh, I'm going to shoot 50% up of the way of what I can see, well, really you're like almost already outside of their chest cavity. And so really and this is where like taking the time to observe exactly the angle of what they're lying, or exactly how they're how deep you think they're positioned, is super important for making sure that that shot goes into the right place. Because so often we see it, and even from personal experience, where you shoot a pig too high because you don't realize how much of them is submerged in the water or in the mud or in a bed. And then what actually happens is, instead of hitting them, through the center of the lungs, just say, or the top of the heart, you're actually hitting them like really high lung, or, potentially through the spine, or even higher in the backstrap or something like that, because you just don't realize how much of them is down. And so for me personally, like really with bedded pigs and even pigs in the water, whether that be like standing feeding or whether that be in a wallow, like you're pretty much going to be aiming for the brush line or the water line, if not lower. So just to make sure, because really if we tell you that on average a third of the pig is under, well, you pretty much want to be aiming for that bottom third, like the top of the bottom third, if that makes sense. Like that's where the top of the heart's going to be sitting, everything like that. So just trying to go as low as you can and remind yourself that there's sort of more of the pig there is super important, and making sure that you're not just like going for the middle of what's exposed, because you'll just be hitting them way too high, and often you'll be watching them run away with an arrow in the top of their back.
I think also having like realistic expectations as to what your projectile or arrow can achieve too. And James said it really well there with like the water lines and what I think of as like obstructions when considering, like, if a boar is bedded in a bit of a dry wallow, or maybe has a little bit of water on his belly, but then he's laying there, you can see his left-hand side and his right-hand side's right up against the bank. There's no way any arrow of any design, any, specific specifications or strength or anything like that, shooting out of even a 100-pound bow, is going to punch through that pig's left-hand side shoulder, through the right-hand side shoulder, and disappear into basically cement. If you imagine like the Northern Territory, like water bank, for example, or a bank or a bit of brush. Maybe if it's sand or something like that, it might be able to punch through. But you've got to have the expectation that your entry is exactly where you want it, and you're aiming ideally for a really good offside shot. And if it keeps going and that arrow passes through, then great. But what you would have seen in a lot of our videos is that we only got probably a third, 2/3, half the arrow penetration, and not by fault of the arrow. It's purely fault of the circumstance in these situations where the arrow's got so much kinetic energy, it's hitting the animal, but then that bank or that basically, obstruction on the other side stops all its momentum. So you're really relying on, you got to think there as well, because that arrow is not going through and achieving a complete pass through. That one hole that you've achieved, again, on this example, on the left-hand side of that bore, is still half closed up by the arrow. So you're relying on that arrow getting in there, again, your broadhead and stuff doing the right job, and that animal hopefully expiring within, a close proximity to where you've shot it, so that the blood trail is not difficult. Because in most instances, if you say to me, do you want an entry and an exit, 2 holes in an animal that you've shot, I'd be like, yep, 100% of the time, that's what I'd prefer, compared to an entry versus, entry exit. And I think just by being realistic, so if you think, oh, I'm going to put this arrow in here and hopefully it comes out there, with bedded shots, quite often it's not actually what occurs. You are getting that entry, but sometimes some of these pigs that we were shooting and killing, we were just lucky we knew where we had to aim to get 6 inches of peno, 8 inches of peno, 10 inches of peno, and that was enough to actually bring, a 100 kilo boar down within bow range and have him expire within 30 to 40 meters. So if you're not absolutely certain on your entry point, then you have to be really, really careful, because you don't always get an exit in these situations.
I think it was actually surprising for me, we had, super sharp broadheads, but just these pigs in particular that were shooting in the Northern Territory, like most of the boars that we were shooting, as I'm sure you can tell, like they were huge pigs. Like most of these pigs would have been over 90 kilos, if not 100 kilo boars, plus the fact that they had, a very good covering of thick mud, if not like being in the mud when we shot them. The penetration that we're getting on these bedded pigs compared to ones I think the first boar that you see in my part 4 that gets shot, the only thing holding the arrow left in was the fletchers. Whereas when I'm shooting these bedded boars, like often I was only getting half the shaft to 3/4 of the shaft, through on the entry side, and it was just sort of poking through on the exit, just purely because you've got the extra mud in there, which is obviously going to dull the broadheads on entry, and just trying to get through more, like body structure, I guess, in the sense of when pigs are bedded, their anatomy is very like closed up. So when you've got a pig standing there at 20 yards and you shoot them, well, their humerus muscle and everything and their shoulder and everything is extended, like it's in the most open position possible. And often, you may break through a scapula. Like if they've got the leg closest to you forward, you're going to go through the fighting pad, you're going to hit the ribs, you're going to go through hopefully the top of the heart or the heart, and then you're going to go through the ribs, and then you might break like the offside scapula or something like that. Whereas with these bedded boars, because they've got their sort of legs tucked up, especially if they're bedded sternally or even on the side, on a 45-degree angle, just say, you're often shooting through like bone. So you're often going through the scapula, then through the scapula, through fighting shield, through the scapula, and then through into the ribs, and then into the heart, hopefully, and then out the other side. And you've got to compete with the exact same on the other side, which obviously going through that much more bone structure is going to decrease your penetration dramatically. And it also sort of decreases your shot angle in the sense that or shot opportunities, I should say, in the sense that, yeah, there's some angles, and that's where like you're talking about good gear, like a pilot cut, obviously talking about bows, was designed for shooting these bedded pigs, because if your shot angle is too steep, like I've personally seen where people have tried to shoot really steep shot angles with, just common broadheads and watched broadheads skim off the arse of pigs. It's probably a video I should put up on Instagram. But yeah, like I've got this video of someone at 20 meters that goes to shoot this boar, and it literally like skims off it and then goes into the bank, and like this cracking boar just runs off. But that's where like having good equipment, especially for bedded boars, like I said, like the pilot cut was designed so that when the back of like the broad, like when it's skimming along the ribs or skimming along the top of the flank of a boar, just say, that the wing essentially of the pilot kite, if you look at it like a plane, actually instead of it just skimming along and running along, like it actually digs it in, and then that's where it like changes the angle of the arrow and actually gets it to penetrate. And hence why, obviously the guys at Cobourg who specialize on bedded boars designed an arrow, or sorry, I should say designed a broadhead specifically for this.
I think just, with emphasis on the anatomy of these boars is super important. That's where, like, obviously when we talk about broadside shots, most of us think on a standing animal, where, again, a lot of the time, one of the reasons why most people like a broadside shot is because we have the ability to watch that, if we're, again, looking on it on the left-hand side of the animal, we watch that left front leg moves forward. It opens up the vitals even further, less bone and things to contend with, really allows for the heart and lungs to be, accessed more readily from that left-hand side. But it also gives us a point of exit to aim for that right-hand side or the offside leg. And I think that's why people go, oh, broadside, yep, best shot in the market. Whereas, on a bedded boar, for example, a broadside shot might actually be the most amount of bone. Whereas if you think maybe if I can get 5 steps back and not have it too tight quartering away and still have a nice quartering away shot where potentially, say you've got, just for the sake of this exercise, I'm sitting in front of, the podcast gear here. And if I outstretch my hands just in front of my face there, if you were to try and come and basically tickle me or put something through my rib cage, if I have both of my arms out extended in front of my body, it's pretty easy to come in and access my ribs and obviously my vitals. The second I just simply bring my elbows back, as if to give myself a bit of a hug or just squeeze my chest, like my hands are now on my pecs, just simply by putting my arms on my chest, my shoulder has come in really tight to my body. My elbows are flexed and right up along my rib cage, basically from, the point of my hip is now all covered up to my basically shoulders. And if you were to come and try and tickle me, one, you're going to have to try and get in under my arms and elbows and things just to access my ribs. But it's so much more difficult because, again, like I'm now putting pressure, and if I was bedded and laying on that, it exacerbates that even greater again. And I think that's where a broadside shot on bedded pigs is still really, really difficult. And again, if you can like get in there and glass with your binoculars and be like, oh yeah, he's pretty much broadside, but his elbow's not quite tucked up, or I can creep it in behind the scapula there, or his left leg's flicked forward or whatever a bit further back, and you can get in front of the shoulder. There's so many different avenues to get in there, but just being able to sit there and assess and really go, this broadside shot is not a typical, easy case broadside shot like a standing animal. There's so many more factors. And that's why I personally, again, as I was saying earlier, really like the quartering away, where if I can get behind that shoulder and elbow that's flexed right up and just slightly enter that broadhead in our situation as bow hunters in behind that front leg on one side, still aiming for the offside on the other, it just removes that whole leg, meat, muscle, bone component. And as long as you can get into the chest, then it's only competing with like chest wall. And again, that's still in a big boar. You got fighting shield, mud, muscle, meat, all this type of stuff, rib cage, and then, obviously the contents within the thoracic cavity, which is the heart and lungs, which we're wanting to hit. And again, that's where knowing your gear and knowing how much peno you need just to at least hit one side of the lungs, potentially heart, is going to be important. But we should all be striving to get, a pass through, or at least hit that offside shoulder and try and get that to come into play where we're achieving double lungs. Because some of these big boars, like as James was saying, are 90, 100 kilos. They'll even run through, if you shoot them bedded in water, they'll run through a 30, 40 meter billabong, get out the other side and run a couple hundred meters super easily, just on adrenaline and sheer muscle size and determination to live, even to a really good one-sided lung shot.
And I think that's where it's really important to know your gear, like what Ayden was saying, and just know how much sort of penetration you can get. Like if you're shooting a lighter arrow or a lighter, bullet, like I'm assuming most people hunting boars and stuff are going to use appropriate caliber. We're not going to pretend to be marksmen in terms of giving, rifle caliber suggestions and stuff like that. But you want to use a fairly sort of heavy bullet. Like, I mean, if you're hunting creek banks, you're not expecting to be doing a couple of 100-meter shots. Like it's all fairly tight scenarios, whether it's with a bow or with a rifle. But yeah, especially like making sure you've got enough gun or enough bow, like using a 50-pound bow and a light arrow. Like, I mean, you can you can certainly, like, it's, if the pig was standing, you can certainly penetrate easily through a bore, but it's just making sure your broadheads are incredibly sharp. And just trying to avoid that bone, like Ayden was saying. But equally, you also don't want to go too far the wrong way and make it too steep of a quartering way angle. Like, there is very much a sweet spot because, like I was saying before, like, you sort of do get less penetration when they're bedded. And especially if they're in mud and stuff like that, where it's going to dull the broadhead quite quickly. Just taking into account that, you want to make sure that you get your arrow or the bullet in where it needs to go to make it a lethal shot.
Originating in Texas, USA, Numa Outdoors has formulated a durable, breathable, quiet and comfortable camouflage lineup for all terrain, seasons and pursuits. You may have seen us across our socials running the new Renegade lineup in our recent Northern Territory adventures. That's because the Renegade lineup is perfect for early season, hot and humid conditions in the heat. We're pleased to announce that the Numa camouflage lineup is stocked exclusively by Venture Hunting and Outdoors here in Australia and available now. Head to their website to check out the whole range today. So we've just touched on quite a few of the challenges, and there's definitely going to be more that we haven't necessarily talked about there, but hopefully you can get a bit of understanding as to why what we're going to get into now with gear choices is so important. And I guess from a bow hunting perspective, some of the factors that we look at immediately, I know both James and I, we shoot different broadheads. He's shooting the 150 grain pilot cuts from Cayuga, and I'm shooting their 150 grain Zots, which are a 2-blade broadhead. James simply has added in the bleeders, but the commonality there is that we're both shooting solid 2-blade broadheads. And I think that's super important when you're considering bedded bores, is because, there are going to be blokes out there that are shooting them with 3-blade broadheads. But immediately when you start thinking about reduced penetration on bedded bores in particular, and then you think about one of the benefits of a 3-blade broadhead is going to be, increased cutting diameter, increased blood trails, all these types of things. That's all great. But if you've got, knowing the biology and the background of these bedded bores and potentially having decreased penetration as a thing, if you know that your gear then has decreased penetration as a feature of a 3-blade broadhead, then you're going to obviously be stacking it up against it. And another thing when it comes to broadheads that we really like about these solid 2-blade broadheads that we're running from Cayuga is that they're cut on contact. There's no hit the animal, deploy blades, all these type of things. And that's where I think mechanical, even expandable heads, when you're factoring in just matted hair, fighting shield, all this mud, water, potentially sticks and things lying very close to the animal, a bit of debris, brush if they're in a sort of obstructed sort of bed. There's just so many variables there that, make it hard for that broadhead to do its job. So again, we've always sort of really enjoyed shooting 2-blade broadheads. We just find the ease of sharpening, all that type of stuff, and then putting it in the right place is, going to be key to achieving the results we want. And that's why I think for bedded boar hunts, and if you're going up to Cayuga broadheads, there's going to be opportunity to shoot, lighter frame pigs in a swamp if they're standing up broadside or something like that with 3-blade. Yep, that's great. But for those like stalks on bedded boars, I think if you're going into it with a 3-blade broadhead, you're going to be more prepared for, not the results you want and potentially losing animals, having it skim off, getting less than adequate penetration and ultimately losing game. And that's just one of the key things that I'd really like to talk about there. And then obviously you've got things like arrows, which I'm sure James can sort of talk about a little bit.
Yeah, I think definitely just talking about how much bone structure you're potentially going to need to punch through. Obviously have a bow, obviously have an arrow set up that, corresponds with the weight of the bow that you're shooting. Equally the same with, bullets, like have a bullet weight that corresponds to the gun that you're shooting and the caliber. But I think the big thing is making sure, specifically to arrows, that you've, like for me, an outsert scenario is very important, and like a really strong supported outsert, because often, that's when you see these deflections and deviations, and even arrows snapping if you're using like poorer quality. I don't want to name any of these shafts, but you do pay for the arrow that you purchase, I guess. And there's nothing worse than going on these big trips. Like I imagine most people going up north to hunt these bedded boars, or going out west. Like there's quite not only a time in travel, but also time in just time away and, investment away from family and stuff. And obviously we love doing these sort of hunts, but just making sure you get the most out of it. And I'd hate for people's gear to let themselves down. Like Ayden and I run day 6 arrows, or day 6 shafts, I should say. But just making sure that you've got a really strong, well-researched shaft that has a good outsert, that is going to stand up to any bone. If you do have to punch it through that humerus or shoulder, or potentially if the pig's lying on its side and you've got to like punch through its spine or the top of its scapula or something like that, just knowing that it's going to do the job and it's not going to break or deviate, a couple of inches in, because there's nothing worse than, you've finally found the pig of your dreams. You can see there's a couple of inches of ivory hanging out the front of its jaw, and then you shoot it with either, a caliber that's, too small and, it expands, just say, with a rifle, it expands, hits the mud and expands, and you only get a little bit of peno and the ball runs off, or with an arrow, or a mechanical or something like that, where it expands on the mud and doesn't get the penetration required, or it gets sort of bound up in the bone structure of the shoulder or the ribs, and it doesn't actually get into where it goes. Because these are often, we're talking about, like, sometimes they can be wrung out old boars, especially if it's a bad season, it's really dry, like where you've got these big frame pigs but there's not much, like there's a lot of muscle wastage and stuff. But sometimes you can get these swamp behemoths too that are just huge boars, like 90, 100 plus kilo pigs, where, like we're talking about an inch or more of fighting shield plus all this bone structure. So making sure that you've got good gear that's going to stand up, as you've heard from us time and time again, is critically important. So making sure you've got a good broadhead and a good arrow is definitely going to help you on this hunt.
I want to also just take a step back from, I guess, the pointy end and what's doing the damage, and just come back to like the sight and the sight housing too, because I think it's really important from a perspective of knowing how your arrow flies, especially when you're considering a boar that may be bedded under a bit of a bush or a fallen log or a limb, or shooting, you want to shoot over a certain amount of water or a bank or something like that, but shoot under that log. If you've never really shot your bow from a kneeling position, a standing position, a squatting position, a seated position, a on hands and knees position, because it's easy enough to get back to full draw on these bedded pigs. Again, most of the time they've got their eyes shut. But if you've never taken a shot, from your knees to get under a limb, and don't know how your bow or your arrow comes out of that bow, and how your sight housing needs to be positioned, or if you've got a fixed pin sight where all 3 pins are covering that pig at 12 meters, and you're trying to make sure that top pin that you want to be using, your 10 meter pin, is really clear on it, that's where something like, we've been shooting the option archery sights lately, and I really loved it over the rut for being able to have the single pin clarity, I guess, and just one option. But then also I can flick that away or flick it forward depending on how you're looking at it, and have 3 or 4 or 5 pins come up. Because again, there is benefit to having multi-pin sights in these situations. Say the boar's at 10 meters and you want to make a shot, or you think, I'm going to get to 10 meters, but he suddenly gets up and runs off and stops on the bank at 30. By having multiple pins, you can still shoot him at 30 if he presents that shot and isn't too aware. Like, there's definitely a benefit to having multi-pins. But say you do get to 10 or 12 meters or 16 meters, and you go, geez, if he's at 15 meters, do I use my 10 meter pin or do I use my 20 meter pin? If you've got a pin with a slider, you can just adjust that to 15 meters precisely, whip out all the fixed pins that you've got, and shoot it with a single pin. Just having that, I guess, one floating pin over the animal, knowing how that arrow is going to fly out of the bow, and the fact that it's going to hit exactly where you're aiming, is going to be a really cool avenue, and something that obviously is going to make your success and outcome much better and more beneficial.
So we've jumped into the pros and cons of shooting bedded boar. We've discussed all the gear, and I think now we might change it up and just share some of our favorite stories from the part 3 and part 4 hunt that you guys saw. So for me, definitely my favorite stalk for sure it wasn't really a stalk in the sense we obviously, if you've watched the videos, there was this little clump of water that was probably about the size of a tennis ball court, that was the only one that we reckon that didn't have a crocodile in it, after seeing a few swamps with crocodiles and plenty of croc slides and, areas where they were sunning themselves and whatnot. And we found this one spot that just was an oasis for pigs, I guess. And after Ayden had his fantastic day and got a couple of good boars, we decided to go back because we had some time, and we went back straight to the water, knowing that middle of the day pigs are going to be bedded, and we're sort of sitting there glassing some pigs on the far side, and to our surprise, we like looked into the mud that we just hadn't even seen, and here, like 25 meters away already, are these. First I should say there was this one boar, and this pig is like up to its pretty much the base of its chin, like a little submarine, I guess, in this mud. Like you can just see the top of his back, and his ears, and the rest of him's like submerged. And we didn't even realize because there was a second boar there, hidden behind the log, and so it actually got all the way in there, and we're only it must have been like 12 meters or 13 meters, like fairly close quarters. And really, it's just waiting for that shot angle, like what we've said. Like they were so deep in that mud that it's like, I could, unless I was standing, up in a tree shooting down, like there was really nothing that I could do. And you can often see in the video where I actually get up on logs to shoot these pigs, just trying to improve that shot angle, and get a little bit more, sort of into the right area, I guess. But for me, it was just really cool to stalk in on these boars, and you're pretty much sitting there 5-10 minutes waiting for them to give you the shot that they want, and you saw them shuffling around the mud and whatnot, and to shoot one pig from one location, to be honest, I didn't get a heap of peno, but I knew it was in the right spot, and especially having that pilot cut with the bleeders, like it does make very big holes and wound channels. Just back the broadhead that it did its job. It didn't get, like I said, didn't get a heap of peno. It probably only got 15 inches of peno or so, and was a fairly steep quartering angle. But to watch that first ball run up, get out of the mud and sort of stumble over a log, and you don't see it in the video, but it pretty much went another like 10 steps behind some timber and fell over, and to quickly put another arrow on while the other boar sort of like, I guess he wasn't even disturbed, which was crazy, but sort of get up and shift to another wallow, and then draw back and go, oi, 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 and he got up and runs out, and then shoot him, and to shoot two like huge cracking boars pretty much from the same location, just turning 20 degrees change in angle was awesome. And just to see these pigs, like I don't know, like you see in the video me trying to pull these pigs out, so I don't imagine how hard it was. Like they're pretty much buried in there, trying to escape the heat of the day and get a bit of probably ectoparasites off them, but also just cool down as well. But it was just an awesome experience to be able to hunt them, but pretty awesome hunt as well. Whether you're making your way up a scree cliff or hiking a distant trail, you want to be confident in the boots that you wear. And for Ayden and I, that means Lower. We've been running the Lower Ranger GTX3s for over 5 years now, and we've never even had a blister. We've teamed up with the Lower team to extend their generosity to you to get you a unique 10% off code by using the code TWINELEMENTS10 at checkout to get 10% off your next order. We know you're going to love them.
I think my favourite hunt, coming back a day, and this is all seen on part 3 of that YouTube series of the banteng and boar bow hunt that's now live and everyone's hopefully seen a little bit of, would be, again, another double up on boars. And it was probably just the closeness and proximity of these big boars to just basically be sitting in each other's laps. And I think, again, it was just based, as James said, on that resource and that drying up resource of the water, being close to their food source, and probably the factor that, we were hunting in Australia's Cobourg Peninsula, where it's just infested with crocodiles, heaps of big saltwater crocodiles that obviously prey on these pigs. And the only reason I can think of those boars being in that one specific swamp was that they must have known something that we didn't. They knew that maybe there wasn't a crocodile feeding under that swamp or something like that, but they were happy enough to go in there and game enough to go in there. And anyway, that brings us to my stalk where, again, we'd shot a few pigs this day. Like I'd shot probably 2 or 3 other handy boars from memory, and we were getting up closer to sort of dark and nightfall, and I was sort of thinking, how much better can this get, when just as we neared this water source, one boar actually stood up, and I saw this pig and I saw his big ears and big floppy ears and just his frame, and I was like, he's easily 100 kilos, like good pig. I could see his ivory from a long way away. And he just stood up and rebedded. And I remember looking at James, like, and the wind wasn't very good. And I just said to James, like, we're going to need to get in on him. And we're also going to need to, like, shoot him at probably 5 meters or less. Like, we're going to have to, because where he was bedded was these massive big sort of swamps and mangrovey plants and trees and stuff had these big sort of root bases. He was right in amongst them, but there was so much deadfall from, probably previous storms and things like that, and just, the harsh environment where these trees were dying and whatnot. And we sort of, James and I are creeping in there over this really dry, crackly mud. And I remember just thinking, geez, like it's going to be tricky to get in unconcealed and have him, not know we're there. And we did eventually get into about 5 meters, and I drew back, and unbeknownst to me, James was filming just over my right-hand side shoulder. So I'd drawn back, was completely hidden by this boar, and I was just trying to edge out of the tree to sort of uncover what shot angle was presented, knowing that I kind of saw him bedding, quartering onto us. And as you'll see in the video, as I sort of edge around the tree, the boar was already up, to my surprise, looking at us. Like he'd already seen or heard something in that last approach. And when my eye met, him at less than 5 meters, he kind of didn't get enough of us as to know what was wrong. And again, we're hunting in an extremely, extremely remote place where these pigs have probably never ever seen, smelt, heard humans, nothing like that, unless it's some of the indigenous people that live on nearby communities. But again, it was so far in the middle of nowhere that I'd say that's probably like unlikely. And I guess knowing this, when the boar sort of saw enough of an outline behind this tree to go, nah, something's going on, I don't like it, I knew that by being at full draw, I was going to get a shot opportunity. And I was just lucky that he ran out to a spot and sort of stopped with a few oys to what we'd let out. He ended up stopping, still sort of slightly broadside quartering on. And I was able to shoot, and he didn't necessarily duck the string, but because he was aware, like it did hit him, and he kind of rolled with it. And again, didn't achieve much peno, but I'd hit him in the point of the shoulder and knew the broadhead. Again, a solid 2-blade had done the job. And as he was sort of sitting there spinning in a circle, thrashing, I looked over, like, because I was looking at where it just ended up. I looked over him, and less than 50 meters away, there was this other boar. And I just remember seeing like ivory sticking out of his jaw as he sat there sort of under this big log. And he was just sitting there almost like a dog laying on its sort of side with its legs out. And this thing was a monster as well. And again, I could see the hooks laying there, and I knew this pig that we just shot was dead. And we basically walked past him, kept going to this next pig, snuck into like 15 or so meters, and you'll see I end up shooting him sort of just before the scapula. So it was sort of slightly quartering on before the scapula on one side, and that arrow just disappears into the fletchers, and sure enough, he went like 30 or 40 meters or whatever it was, and succumbed to the effects of the arrow. And we dragged those two boars together, and it was just a bit of a like pinch yourself sort of moment as to, we'd walked for tens of kilometers that morning without seeing a heap. Like, don't get us wrong, we'd seen heaps of wildlife, like a lot of, crocodiles, a lot of buffalo, a lot of, even banteng bulls and all this type of stuff, but we just couldn't find any pigs. And then as soon as that setting and that scenery was right, and in this instance, it was that one little secluded waterhole, we just it was like unearthed in front of us, just tens of opportunities on bedded boars. And to go and do that, it was sort of how good is this kind of moment. I honestly think some of that bow hunting, and I think probably part 4 more so when James went back and sort of had an accelerated version of what I'd achieved in that day or that afternoon of hunting a few good boars and finding that swamp sort of later in the afternoon. James was able to go and relive that the next day when it had already been a little bit pressured, so some of the boars were probably gone. But I think, again, just with that depleted resource, them coming into a water source that they needed in the middle of nowhere, like he had one of the best days of bow hunting in his life, let alone anyone's life that I've ever seen. Like some of the pigs that we managed to take were just exceptional, and the sense of adventure was unreal, like second to none. So it was an amazing experience, and you guys can all go and watch that now on the YouTube channel.
Well, thank you guys for tuning into this episode. Hopefully you've got the fundamentals down now to take on and tackle any bedded boars that you see, hopefully not physically, but hopefully with your bow or your rifle. I mean, if you want to do that physically, have at it. But hopefully you know the things to think about and take into consideration in planning your stalk. And then, just, whether you are planning one of these big trips out west or up north, even some stuff around gear just to be well prepared for your trip. But now we're just going to jump into our FAQ, our question segment. So if you guys have a question that you'd like us to answer on the podcast, please send it in to us either on social media at Instagram at the Twin Elements account, Ayden Doumtsis Outdoors, or James Doumtsis Outdoors account, or you can email us at info@twinelements.com.au with the subject line FAQ, and we will get to it on a future podcast. But this question came in from Stephen Dorr. The question was, hey lads, absolutely frothing all your recent content, especially everything on the podcast. One topic which I'd love to hear about from you guys on the podcast is bow hunting sambar. I've hunted them once before with a rifle, and I'm lucky enough to be heading back to Victoria in September, this time with the hopes to take one with the bow. This doesn't seem to be a whole lot of hunting. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of bow hunting specific content about them, so I'd love to hear from your experiences with them. Many thanks in advance. Steve from Western Australia.
Alrighty, so I'm happy to tackle this one as there was a period of my life there where I was pretty dedicated and sort of somewhat obsessed with sambar deer, probably hunting them 3 to 4 times a week at a minimum, not too far from home there in Victoria as a young lad. And honestly, my biggest tips, without getting too much into the detail, just because I could talk about sambar deer forever, and we'll probably end up doing a future podcast specifically on sambar deer and some of their habits and things. But my biggest advice come September, knowing that that's most likely going to be entering their rut, if not peak rut would be September for most places around, Victoria, southeastern Australia, going into October, would be sort of, as a bow hunter, like in my mind, either ambush or hunting and slowly moving through their travel routes. I think bow hunting their bedding areas, just with all that thick tea tree and dogwood and stuff like that, would be quite difficult. But I used to honestly go out all day, and what I would sort of rely upon, I guess, would be just my knowledge of where the hinds were bedding, and then also where like things like wallows were, where rub trees were, preach trees were, all this type of stuff, and trying to work out that, okay, the rut is unfolding before us. It's like any animals. The males, whilst they may not live with the females, are going to be wanting to live close enough by so that when these females come into season, that they're going to want to be checking out, these hinds, coming in, servicing these hinds, and that's going to increase, one, their just, receptivity to being out in daylight for longer, because often sambar deer are quite secretive and, elusive. And I think for me, like I remember there was not a statistic or anything, like it was just my observations, but say from, January through till August, I'd seen maybe 3 or 4 stags over that period of time, and I'd been hunting quite a lot. And again, I knew where all the hinds were. I knew that in that gully under that patch of tea tree, that hind would live with her fawn. And then there was often, half of the time that I'd go there, there'd be a spiker with them, and half the time that spiker would be elsewhere. And, go to the next gully, and those 3 hinds lived there, and that second hind lived over there on Sundays. So like I really did have this herd sort of patterned where I was hunting. As soon as September came around, I remember it went from like, not seeing a stag on most trips to, in the month of September, seeing something like 11 stags of varying sizes, with a couple of them being mature. And this all happened in a very quick window. And like some of the things that I noticed firstly were, September's a great time. Again, once I start seeing sort of in Victoria, you get a lot of those wattles and stuff. Once they start blossoming and flowering and you see all that yellow flower, it's a great time to be hunting sambar deer. So Steve, like you're in the right ballpark there for rutting activity, but just being super alert and like being able to observe where the rubs are, like, because it's all good knowing where one big cherry tree is that gets smashed, throughout the year. But if you start noticing a few like real fresh rubs on one particular game trail where they're just hitting a few of these little saplings and stuff like that, it might get, and that there's a wallow in that gully and you're starting to notice a bit more fresh mud from that wallow on trees, I would be trying to, in the last, hour of light, if the wind permits, sitting off that. And you don't necessarily have to be sitting on the wallow, but sometimes I would go, okay, the wallow's there, where I think the stags are bedding is here. By the time a stag leaves his secluded bedding area to get to that wallow, it's often in the, secrecy of darkness or nightfall. So if you can, as a bow hunter, maybe start at the wallow 2 or 3 hours earlier and super slowly, I'm talking like one step at a time, be on a really good game trail, prominent game trail, maybe 2/3 up the ridge, 1/3 off the top of the ridge or something like that. Walk along with the wind in your face is essential. And again, you want to be walking one step and glassing. And I emphasize glassing massively because I know a lot of people with sambar deer go, it's the same as the Northern Territory. They sort of lose their optics because they go, nah, a buffalo bull's massive. I'll be able to see him in the open easily. And that's fine most of the time. But if a sambar deer is covered by 3 branches, it's amazing how a deer that's probably 250, 300 kilos just blends into that bush so seamlessly. And especially when you've got thick dogwood, thick tea tree, blackberries, whatever country you're sort of hunting in, they just disappear so easily. And honestly, a sambar deer, I think where a lot of people go wrong is they see them and they have the urge to try and get in on them so quickly because they have the tendency to just vanish, take 2 steps into the bush, and people are like, no, they disappeared. And I think what happens is people then take 10 steps too quickly, trying to stalk in and cut the distance on that stag without realizing the stag's literally taken 2 steps and he's standing there just listening and being very alert to their surrounds, like what sambar deer do. And they've watched you come in, often walk past them, and that's when they bark and they'll let you know, like, hey, mate, you literally just shit the bed. You've walked past me. I hadn't moved. If you'd have been slightly more patient, controlled your impulses, and just, maybe glassed a little bit more and kept better track of where the animal is, you're going to have better odds of success. But my biggest thing there, if you can take away, would be just walk the game trails super, super slowly and let, like, the stag's going to be moving, more active, more prone to being susceptible at daylight hours, and that might give you an avenue to taking one. I know for me, I shot a couple of stags, being, happy to shoot them slightly quartering on as they're walking towards you on game trails. And again, I'd seen both of these stags that I shot within a 4-day window, and my ability to sort of change course undetected, drop down 10 meters onto a better game trail, and then stop at a tree was what sort of secured one stag. And I let him walk the last, 30 meters into me where I shot him at 18 meters. Whereas if I had to try to sneak in from, 50 or 60 or 70 where I saw him into 18 meters, I would nearly say that's half impossible with sambar deer. Like, unless the circumstances are perfect, to be able to stalk into bow range is extremely hard, but being able to sneak in close enough and letting them take the last few steps and almost intercepting them is definitely achievable, especially, come September. The bush is often pretty crunchy, pretty dry, like haven't had as much rain and stuff like that. So it can be quite hard when you're hunting, these deer that have got ears the size of, small dinner plates as well. Well, hopefully that answers your question, Steve. Best of luck for September. Hope this podcast gets to you just in time. But honestly, we will definitely get another podcast out on sambar deer and just, certain tips and things like that. We love talking about all the different deer species, but that should hopefully give you a bit of enough direction for now into trying to secure a nice stag.
Need a caffeine hit? We've got you covered. Power your passions with OzCaff Energy. Designed to be convenient, discreet and portable. These small caffeine pouches pack a punch and will get you out of those lows in no time. Place one of the pouches under your top lip for rapid absorption, which will have you performing your best in no time. With added benefits of 0 calories and 0 sugar, there's nothing to lose. Use code TWINELEMENTS for 10% off your next order. Well, thank you, legends, for listening to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast. We really do appreciate all your support, and hopefully you're getting plenty of tips and tricks and learning lots from this podcast. We do try and cover a fair few different topics, and as Ayden said, we will get to sambar in the future. There's just, a lot of hunting to do in Australia, here in New Zealand and abroad, and we obviously want to cover it all. So stick around. There's going to be plenty to learn, and thank you for your support so far. We like to reward you guys for listening to this podcast, and in doing so, that's why we've created the Twin Elements podcast code, which gives you guys 10% off our prints on our website. So there's 40 prints there. There's, specific wildlife ones where it might be birds, all the way up to, Northern Territory themed stuff, elk themed stuff, deer, of all different kinds of photos and whatnot. There's an incredible range there of quality prints. So make sure to check them out on the website and use that Twin Elements podcast code to get 10% off on your order. And that's just us wanting to thank you guys for supporting us through the podcast. We really do appreciate it.
As you guys would have heard over the past month or so, we've been releasing plenty of films from our epic Northern Territory bow hunting adventure. These are all available on the Twin Elements YouTube channel. It's been growing really, really well with plenty of people subscribing, and we would urge you guys to do so. One, just to keep up to date with all the content, but secondly, it helps us massively, obviously fighting things like algorithms and whatnot, and, hunting being a bit of a minority. if we can keep growing this viewership, it's absolutely massive to us and keeps us, powering our adventures. Even little things like liking, commenting, letting us know that you're liking the content and stuff like that. We see all the comments and we really do appreciate it all. Hopefully this specific podcast gives you guys a bit of a taste for the bow hunting bedded boars, and hopefully James and my story on, those boar doubles gives you guys a bit of motivation to go and watch those. But more specifically, part 3 and part 4 of our recent banteng and boar bow hunt are the ones you guys want to watch, just to see what we're talking about when we're talking about, reduced shot angles, boars in the mud, the effects of, mud and different shot angles on pulling up a broadhead or an arrow. There's basically a ton of real life examples there, where you can see us shooting a few hefty boars from Australia's Northern Territory.
And lastly, you're on here already, so if you guys could please, I'm sure you all subscribe, but also remember to review and rate the podcast. It just helps, like what Ayden was saying with the algorithm, get shared to other people that obviously we think are going to be valued listeners and appreciate the content we put out there. So please remember to review and rate the podcast. Thank you all again for the support and the love that you guys show us across all our platforms, whether that be on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, or here. We appreciate it all. Recently, we've just done the Venture Hunting and Outdoors Expo, and a heap of you legends were there, came down and said hello. And it's just great to be a part of such a beautiful hunting community. And we appreciate all the support and all the kind words that we get from you guys. It makes all those long hours sitting behind a laptop, editing videos or podcasts or doing these podcasts a little bit easier. But yeah, we do really appreciate it. So thank you very much, guys. And we'll catch you on next week's podcast.
See you then.